There is a jet climbing somewhere overhead, and a freeway running less than half a mile from where this trail begins. And yet within a few dozen steps the sound thins out, the light goes green, and the air turns cool and wet and faintly sweet with mud. This is 150 acres of marsh and forest and prairie, wrapped completely by a city. It should not exist. The story of why it does is one of the strangest and most stubborn stories in Minnesota. We are in Richfield, Minnesota, an inner ring suburb pressed tight against the southern edge of Minneapolis. Fort Snelling and the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport lie to the east, Bloomington to the south, Edina to the west. The place we are walking is Wood Lake Nature Center, roughly 150 acres of preserved ground, threaded by about 3 miles of trails and boardwalks. 2 interstate highways run within earshot. This is one of the most thoroughly surrounded pieces of wild land you will ever walk. The first thing you notice is that the ground is flat. Not gently rolling, not carved, just flat, the way a table is flat. The trail does not climb. It simply runs level between walls of cottonwood and box elder, and then opens without warning onto a sheet of cattails, so wide it takes a moment to understand you are looking at water. That flatness is not an accident. It is the signature of something enormous that was here long before the city was. Roughly 14,000 years ago, this ground lay under ice. A great tongue of the Laurentide ice sheet called the Des Moines Lobe pushed south out of the north, and from it a smaller finger, the Grantsburg sublobe, swung northeast directly across what is now the Twin Cities. It was so large it dammed the drainage of the Mississippi. When it finally melted back, it left behind exactly what we are standing on. Flat ground. Sand and clay and rock dropped where the ice let go. Ice does not leave a landscape tidy. It leaves it lumpy and pitted and confused, full of shallow hollows with nowhere for water to go. Southern Minnesota is stitched with thousands of these depressions. Most geologists would tell you that is essentially what Wood Lake is. A dent. A low place in glacial ground that filled with water and then, for the next 10,000 years or so, quietly did what low, wet places do. It gathered plants and it gathered life. This is Dakota homeland. A few miles east of this trail, the Minnesota River meets the Mississippi at a place many Dakota people call Bdote, which means where 2 waters come together. For many Dakota, Bdote is not simply a confluence. It is a place of creation, one of the most significant landscapes in this state. The Mdewakanton and Wappitan bands of the Dakota lived across this country for centuries before anyone else arrived here, and Dakota people are still here today. Try to hold 2 pictures at once as we walk. One is the trail in front of us, edged with trimmed grass and a bench. The other is this same flat, wet, oak-dotted country as a place people knew intimately and moved through with the seasons, fishing and hunting and gathering, tapping maples in spring, working the marsh edges in summer. Not a wilderness. A homeland with names and roots and returning places, most of which are simply not written down. Wetlands like this one were not empty ground to be improved. Marshes fed people. Wild rice, waterfowl, muskrat, turtles, fish, cattail root and cattail shoot. A shallow lake ringed with reeds is one of the most productive places in a northern landscape, calorie for calorie, and it stays productive year after year without being plowed. That is worth remembering later in this walk, when we get to the part where a city decides that a marsh is a nuisance and a wasted asset. The trail lifts slightly and turns to boards. Water on both sides now, dark and still and skinned with duckweed, cattails standing shoulder high. It is worth pausing here to say plainly that everything we are about to describe, the treaties, the farms, the highways, happened on top of a landscape that was already fully occupied and fully understood. Nothing here was discovered. What happened is that it changed hands under enormous pressure in a very short span of years. In August of 1829, a Dakota leader named Mapia Wicasta, Cloud Man, founded an agricultural village on the eastern shore of the lake now called Bdote, the Dakota name meaning White Earth Lake, a short distance north of where we stand. The village was called Hayata Atunwi, the village at the side. For about 10 years, its farmers grew enough to feed themselves and neighboring Dakota villages. It was abandoned around 1839 amid conflict, and its people moved on. Bdote is a few miles from this boardwalk. That is the thing that is hard to feel when you are inside a nature center with a parking lot and a paved path. This history is not far away and long ago. It is right here, at a scale you could walk in an afternoon, and it is recent enough that the great-grandchildren of the people involved are alive. The city is young. The claim on the land is younger. In 1805, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike met Dakota leaders at what is now Pike Island and produced a treaty ceding about 100,000 acres at the river confluence so the United States could build a fort. Pike himself valued the land at $200,000. The Senate approved the document with no amount written into it and eventually paid $2,000. Fort Snelling rose on the bluff above Bdote. Everything that follows in this story follows from that fort. For the next 40 years, the fort pulled people upriver. Traders, missionaries, soldiers, lumbermen, farmers. Land that had been Dakota country became, on paper in Washington, a territory waiting to be opened. You can stand on this quiet boardwalk and it seems impossibly remote from all that. But this marsh sits about 5 miles from the fort. It was inside the pressure zone the whole time, and the pressure was about to become law. On the 23rd of July, 1851, at Traverse des Sioux, the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands signed away roughly 21 million acres for about $1 2/3 million in the region of 7.5 cents an acre. 2 weeks later, on the 5th of August, the Mdewakanton and Wapakute signed a nearly identical treaty at Mendota, on terms that were worse. Together, those two documents transferred something close to 24 million acres. The ground under this boardwalk is inside that session. Every house in Richfield, every runway at the airport, every mile of freeway we can hear from here, sits on land that changed hands in those 2 summers of 1851, at a price that even at the time was understood by many to be a fraction of its worth. The Dakota did not vanish afterward. Dakota communities remain in Minnesota today, and they are neighbors, not history. Seven years later, on the 10th of April, 1858, the Hennepin County Board formally established the town of Richfield alongside Minneapolis, Bloomington, and Eden Prairie. The Richfield that was drawn that day was enormous, roughly 63 square miles, running north to what is now Lake Street in Minneapolis and east to the rivers. Over the following century, almost all of it was carved away by its neighbors. The Richfield we are walking in is the remnant. That flat glacial ground, so useless for drama, turned out to be superb for one thing: growing vegetables. The soil was good, the land was level, and Minneapolis was a short wagon ride north with a great many mouths in it. Richfield did not become a mill town or a rail town. It became a garden. For roughly the next 80 years, the defining sound of this place would have been a wagon on a dirt road before dawn. By 1897, Minneapolis had a large covered market on 2nd Street, with a broad platform where growers backed in their wagons and sold. Many of those growers came from Richfield. This was market gardening or truck farming, and it fed the city daily. One local family, the Bachmans, started here in the soil and grew into a floral business that Minnesotans still know by name. Well into the 1920s, Richfield was still, essentially, a farming town. Through all of that, Wood Lake was still a lake, not a marsh. A shallow open water lake big enough to matter, ringed by houses, used for recreation the way small Minnesota lakes always are. Skates in winter, boats in summer. People who grew up here in the 1930s remembered water. Hold onto that image, because in the space of a single decade it is about to be almost entirely erased, and not by anything as dramatic as a drought. The war ended, and Richfield was hit by one of the fastest suburban booms in the country. In 1940, its population was under 10,000. By 1950, it was over 17,000, a rise of more than 360% in a decade. By 1960, it stood near 42,000. Farms became blocks of small starter houses for returning veterans, laid out over the old vegetable fields, street after street after street. Here is the part people forget. When you cover a flat, poorly drained landscape with roofs and roads and driveways, you do not just build houses. You rewrite the way water moves. Rain that used to sink into a field now runs off a shingle, down a gutter, into a pipe. Every new street in Richfield was, quietly, a change in the plumbing of this basin. And the basin was about to be cut open. Construction on Interstate 35W began in 1959, and it came straight down through the middle of this suburb. A freeway is not only a road, it is a deep excavation with its own drainage, and it will happily intercept groundwater and reroute it for miles. Most of Wood Lake's water drained away during the 1950s, and the record is fairly direct about why. It was due in part to the effects of building that highway nearby. Imagine watching that happen from a kitchen window. The shoreline you skated on retreats. The docks stand over mud. Reeds march out across what used to be open water. Within a few years, the lake that gave the neighborhood its name is not a lake at all. It is a low, wet, weedy hollow in the middle of a booming suburb, and in 1960s America, there was a very standard opinion about what a low, wet, weedy hollow was for. It became, in effect, a place to put water the city did not want. Storm drains from around Richfield fed into it. That is not a historical footnote. It is still how this marsh works today. The water we are looking at is fed by multiple pipes carrying street runoff, with a single outflow pipe used when levels get high. A modest rainfall over Richfield can visibly change the water level here within hours. Look at it from the point of view of 1965. You have a degraded former lake, no longer scenic, no longer usable, functionally a drainage sump, sitting on 150 acres of buildable ground inside the fastest growing suburb in Minnesota. The city itself recognized that development was expanding rapidly and could eventually swallow the lake and the land around it. There was no shortage of things you could do with that land instead. And this is where Richfield does something genuinely unusual. In 1969, the Richfield City Council, backed by thousands of residents, voted to turn Wood Lake into a nature center. Not a subdivision, not a shopping center, not a ball field complex. A place set aside permanently to be a marsh, with staff whose job was to explain it to children. In 1969, when the country was still filling wetlands as a matter of routine. Consider the timing. The first Earth Day was still a year away. The Environmental Protection Agency did not yet exist. The Clean Water Act was 3 years off. The word wetland was not yet a thing an ordinary city council said out loud with approval. And a suburb of 40,000 people in Minnesota looked at a ruined lake full of storm runoff and decided it was worth more as a marsh than as real estate. The building opened in 1971, and Wood Lake was dedicated that year as Minnesota's first municipal nature center, one of the very first nature centers built anywhere in the Twin Cities. There were snowshoe programs the winter before it formally opened, and the first proper program ran in May of 1971. In 1991, a citizens group, the Friends of Wood Lake, formed to advocate for it and raise money. It has never stopped. Which brings us here to the best thing in the park, a floating boardwalk laid right on the surface of the marsh, so the water is at the level of your boots and the cattails close over your head. There is no railing separating you from it. You are simply in it. Frogs drop off the boards ahead of you. The whole structure shifts very slightly as you walk. Very few cities let you get this close to a swamp. Cattails are the engine here, and they are ruthless. They spread by root and by seed. They tolerate filthy water. They pull nutrients out of runoff. And they build the very ground they stand in as their old stems collapse and rot. Muskrats cut them for lodges and eat the roots, and in doing so they punch open channels of clear water. A marsh is not a static thing. It is an argument between plants and animals. Under and around all that cattail is a genuinely long list of residents. Painted turtles hauled out on logs, garter snakes on the warm boards, muskrats, raccoons, red foxes, white-tailed deer, coyotes, which most visitors are startled to learn about and almost never see. All of them inside a suburb, in a park with no bikes and no dogs allowed, which is precisely why they tolerate the constant, gentle traffic of people on foot. But the birds are the real reason people come. More than 200 species have been recorded at Wood Lake, which is an absurd number for a patch of ground this size hemmed in by houses and freeway. It is one of the busiest birding hotspots in the Twin Cities. Great blue herons stalking the shallows, wood ducks in the timber, trumpeter swans, bald eagles, great horned owls, barred owls, belted kingfishers, northern harriers hunting low over the reeds. The reason is that this marsh sits directly under the Mississippi Flyway, one of the great migration corridors of North America. Millions of birds move up and down that river corridor twice a year, and they need places to stop, drink, feed, and rest. Look at a map of this metro and ask where a tired migrating bird could safely put down. There is not much, which turns this accidental, storm-fed, half-ruined marsh into something like a service station. It is a different park in every season. Spring brings the return of the herons and the frog chorus. Summer, which is what we have, is thick and green and full of insects. Autumn burns the marsh orange and sends the migrants through in waves. And in winter the whole thing freezes and goes silent, and people cross it on skis and snowshoes, reading the tracks of the animals who never left. Today, Wood Lake takes in more than 100,000 visitors a year. Since the day it opened, it has partnered with Richfield's public schools, so that every student from preschool through 5th grade comes here on field trips at least twice a year. Which means that for over 50 years, essentially every child raised in this city has stood on a boardwalk over a marsh and been shown what lives in it. That is the thing worth carrying out of here. This is not a pristine place. It was drained, degraded, plumbed into the storm sewer, and very nearly written off. Its water is street runoff. Its silence is borrowed from between the jets. Everything about it is compromised. and it is still unmistakably alive, and the reason is not luck. It is that a few thousand ordinary people in 1969 decided it should be. The trail loops back, the traffic returns to the edge of hearing, and the parking lot appears through the trees with a suddenness that feels almost rude. Behind us, the herons go on standing in water that came off somebody's driveway. Ahead of us, the city. The whole point of Woodlake is that these two things are only about 80 steps apart, and that somebody once refused to let one of them eat the other. So that is Woodlake, 150 acres of Dakota homeland, glacial flatland, market garden, drained lake and rescued marsh, sitting quietly inside a suburb of 40,000 people, holding 200 species of birds. It is proof that the wild does not only survive in the far places. Sometimes it survives because a city voted for it. Thank you for watching. Follow for more trails of the world.